My name is Natalie, and I am 33 years old. Enjoy being broke. Your sister and I transferred the $860,000 from your hidden folder. We are boarding a first-class flight to Paris to start the life we deserve. Do not bother calling. That was the email my mother sent me on a Tuesday morning. She thought she had ruined my life and secured my sister a luxurious future. What she did not know was the account she drained was a federal honeypot, and she had just triggered an international manhunt. Before I continue this story about how my own mother and sister committed a federal crime against the United States government, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever watched your toxic family dig their own graves. I sat in my home office overlooking the quiet suburban streets holding my ceramic mug of dark espresso. I read the email twice. My 60-year-old mother Brenda had always been a master of entitlement. She had always treated me as an ATM to fund the glamorous delusions of her golden child, my 36-year-old sister Courtney. But breaking into my house while I was at the gym, bypassing my personal laptop screen and executing an international wire transfer was a new level of audacity. The email was dripping with her usual poison. She claimed she was taking it as back pay for raising me. I did not panic. I simply took another slow sip of my bitter espresso and let the warmth settle in my chest. I opened my security software and watched the active ping of their IP address connecting to the airport lounge network. My calm was abruptly shattered by tires screeching in my driveway. Heavy footsteps pounded up my front porch, followed by frantic knocking. I pulled open the heavy oak door. Standing there was Jamal, my 38-year-old brother-in-law. He was still wearing his navy blue paramedic scrubs, his stethoscope shoved hastily into his cargo pocket. Jamal is a hard-working man, a devoted father, and someone who had endured years of disrespect from my mother and sister. Today, the exhaustion in his eyes was replaced by sheer terror. He pushed past me into the hallway, his chest heaving. "Natalie, she took everything." Jamal gasped, leaning his large frame against the wall. "I just got off a 14-hour overnight shift at the emergency room. I went to buy groceries for the kids and my card was declined. I checked our banking app. Our joint checking account is at zero. The savings account is at zero. Even the college fund I set up for the boys is completely gone." She wiped out $90,000 in a single morning. I guided him into the kitchen and pulled out a stool. He dropped into it, burying his face in his hands. His broad shoulders shook. "She left a note saying she needed to find herself in Europe." Jamal continued, his voice cracking with absolute panic. "She took the money I saved from working double shifts for 6 years. How am I supposed to feed my boys this week? I cannot even pay the mortgage that is due on Friday. She destroyed us, Natalie. She completely destroyed us." I walked over to the coffee maker and poured a fresh cup, sliding it toward him. I looked at this decent, honest man who had been bled dry by my sister. He was hyperventilating, convinced his life was over. "Drink this, Jamal," I said softly, "and then take a deep breath." He looked up at me, his eyes bloodshot and bewildered by my total lack of panic. "How can you be so calm?" he demanded, his voice rising in frustration. "Do you not understand what I just said? Courtney is gone. She stole all my money." I unlocked my phone and pulled up the email Brenda had sent me. I turned the screen toward him. "Read that," I told him. Jamal squinted at the screen. As his eyes scanned the arrogant words my mother had typed, his jaw tightened. When he read the sum of $860,000, the color drained from his face. "They robbed you too," he whispered. "Natalie, we need to call the police right now. We might still be able to stop them from boarding." I leaned against the counter and smiled. "We are definitely not stopping them, Jamal. Because they did not steal my savings. They just stole a digitally tagged federal honeypot account. That money belongs to a cartel, and it is currently being monitored by the FBI. So sit back, drink your coffee, and let them fly." Jamal stared at me, his hand frozen halfway to his mouth with the coffee cup. He blinked once, then twice, the dark circles under his eyes seeming to deepen in the harsh kitchen light. "Cartel," He repeated his voice barely a whisper. FB. Natalie. Please, tell me you are joking. My wife just wiped out our entire life savings, and you are standing there making up spy movie nonsense. We need to call the local police before their flight takes off. I walked back into my home office and motioned for him to follow. He trudged in his heavy work boots, thudding against the hardwood floor. I sat in my ergonomic chair and turned my dual monitors so he could see the complex dashboards filled with cascading data red warning banners and government seals. I am not an ordinary corporate accountant, Jamal, I said, pointing to the screen. For the past 5 years, I have been working as a forensic accountant for a private firm contracted by the Department of Justice. My specific division tracks international money laundering networks and seizes illicit assets. Jamal leaned in, his eyes darting across the screens. He read the official agency logos and the classified warning prompts blinking in the corner. I do not understand, he said, shaking his head. Brenda always said you just did tax returns for boring Midwestern companies. She always mocked your salary. I laughed softly, typing a command into my keyboard to bring up the transaction ledger. That is what I let them believe because our family cannot keep a secret, and Courtney has a habit of trying to exploit anyone she thinks has money or power. That file on my desktop, the one labeled Personal Savings Do Not Touch, was a digital trap. It is called a honeypot in my industry. We had seized those funds from a shell company 3 weeks ago. My team deliberately left the account seemingly vulnerable but heavily monitored on a secure server. We were waiting for the syndicate to try and move the money so we could track their offshore routing numbers. Instead, my mother and your wife broke into my house, stole my security token from the wall safe, and wired the money themselves. Jamal collapsed into the leather guest chair in the corner of my office. He rubbed his temples vigorously, processing the weight of the information. So you are telling me that Courtney did not just steal from us. She stole money that the federal government was using for an active criminal investigation. She took cartel money. Exactly, I nodded, pulling up a specific piece of legislation on the second monitor. And it gets much worse for them. Because they transferred over $10,000 across international borders. Without declaring it, they violated standard federal banking regulations. But since they transferred $860,000 of flagged government funds, it elevates the crime to a completely different stratosphere. By routing that money to a bank in Paris using my stolen credentials, they committed international wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and money laundering. They also triggered the Patriot Act. The moment that money hits the European banking system, Interpol and the French authorities will be automatically notified. The silence in the room was heavy, broken only by the quiet hum of my computer towers processing the data. I watched Jamal absorb the sheer magnitude of what I had just explained. He looked down at his rough hands that had spent the last 12 hours saving lives in an ambulance only to come home to betrayal. The panic that had been suffocating him since he arrived was slowly evaporating. I could see the gears turning in his head. The woman who had constantly belittled his career, who had treated him like a stepping stone, and who had just tried to leave him destitute with 2 young children, had just handed him the ultimate escape route. They are going to federal prison, Jamal said, the realization washing over him. The tremor was gone from his voice. He looked up at me, a strange mixture of shock and vindication in his dark eyes. They thought they were being so clever. Courtney told me yesterday that she was tired of living a mediocre life with a mediocre man. She said she was destined for true luxury. Well, I replied, crossing my arms and looking directly at him. She is going to get a first-class ticket to a concrete cell. The federal government has a 98% conviction rate, Jamal. They do not lose. And right now, the system is automatically freezing every single account associated with her name and social security number. That includes your joint accounts. But because you can prove you were at the hospital during the exact time of the transfer, and because you are a first responder with a pristine record, you are completely shielded from the criminal charges. Jamal took a deep, steadying breath. The slumped posture he had carried in with him vanished. He sat up straight. For the first time in years, he did not look like a man crushed by the weight of his wife's endless demands. He looked like a man who had just been handed the keys to his freedom. "What do we do now?" he asked, his tone steady and resolute. "We watch them dig the hole deeper," I replied. I opened a web browser on my secondary monitor and typed in Courtney's social media handle. She could never keep a secret when she thought she was winning. I clicked her profile and a live broadcast notification popped up. I maximized the video and turned the monitor toward Jamal. Courtney lounged on a velvet chaise in a wildly expensive hotel suite. Through the windows behind her, the Eiffel Tower glittered against the Parisian night sky. She wore a silk robe holding a flute of champagne. Brenda was visible in the background, examining designer shopping bags scattered across the massive king-sized bed. "Hello to all my beautiful followers," Courtney crooned into the camera. "I know you are wondering how I managed this sudden European getaway. Let us just say I finally decided to stop letting other people hold me back. I am manifesting wealth, and honestly, it is so easy when you stop acting like a wage slave." Jamal let out a bitter breath. "A wage slave?" he repeated. "That is what she calls me. I work 70-hour weeks as a paramedic. I see the worst days of people's lives to keep a roof over her head, and she calls me a wage slave." Courtney took a delicate sip of champagne. "Some people are just destined to grind away in mediocrity," she continued. "They work their little shifts, they crunch their little numbers, and expect a medal. True luxury requires taking bold steps. You cannot wait for handouts from people who do not know how to spend their own money." "She is talking about me now," I said. "She has always hated that I refused to fund her lifestyle anymore." Jamal crossed his arms. "You funded her for years, Natalie. I never understood why you let Brenda bully you into paying the lease on Courtney's luxury apartment. You were barely 25, making an entry-level salary, and your mother made you pay $3,000 a month for a place you did not even live in." "I remember the screaming matches perfectly," I replied. "Mom told me that since I was single, it was my absolute duty to support my older sister. She claimed Courtney needed to maintain an image to find a wealthy husband. When I finally cut them off 3 years ago and bought this house, Brenda told the entire extended family I was financially abusing them. She said I was hoarding wealth while my sister struggled." On the screen, Brenda walked up behind Courtney. "Cheers to new beginnings," Brenda announced, raising her glass. "And cheers to taking back what is rightfully ours. Family takes care of family." Courtney laughed, a high-pitched grating sound. "Exactly, Mom. We are just reallocating resources to where they are appreciated." What was she going to do with it? Let it sit in a bank account while she eats microwave dinners? This money is finally breathing the air it deserves. The Ritz. Paris is just the beginning. We are going shopping on the Champs-Élysées tomorrow. I need a whole new wardrobe. The sheer arrogance was staggering. They had stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars from the federal government, and their first instinct was to brag to strangers on the internet. They were so blinded by narcissism, they did not consider the massive digital footprint they were leaving behind. I watched the viewer count tick up as comments flooded the screen. Jamal clenched his heavy jaw. "Are you really going to let them sit there and gloat?" he asked, his voice tight. I turned my attention back to the glowing classified terminal on my desk. "Oh, they can gloat all they want," I said quietly. "Every second they stream, they establish a geographic timeline. They are publicly confessing to the unauthorized transfer of assets. They are doing the federal government's job for them." I brought up the secure portal linking my workstation directly to the Department of Justice Task Force. The flashing red alert was waiting for my confirmation. Once I hit execute, the entire weight of the United States justice system would descend upon them. "Are you sure you are ready for this?" I asked Jamal. "Once I press this key, she becomes an active fugitive in a federal investigation. There is no taking it back." Jamal did not hesitate for a single second. His dark eyes were completely cold and clear. "She made her choice when she stole my kid's future," he said. "Press the button." I turned back to the glowing keyboard, typed my federal clearance code, and pressed enter. The screen blinked green. The IP breach was officially reported to my federal handlers. The trap was sprung. The morning sun gleamed off the pristine glass storefront of the Louis Vuitton flagship boutique on the Champs-Élysées. Inside, Courtney was in her element. She had spent the last 2 hours treating the sharply dressed French sales associates like her personal servants. A mountain of signature orange boxes and leather garment bags was piled high on the polished glass counter. There were 3 Capucines handbags, a limited edition travel trunk, and several cashmere coats. Brenda stood next to her, running her hands over a silk scarf and beaming with the pride only an enabling mother could muster. "That will be all for now," Courtney announced loudly, waving her hand dismissively at the young cashier. "Oh, actually, add that matching wallet. I might need something small for evening events." The cashier, a poised young woman with immaculate makeup, gave a tight professional smile. "Certainly, madame. Your total comes to 42,500 euros. Will you be paying with card today?" "Obviously," Courtney scoffed. She unzipped her purse and dramatically pulled out the sleek metal card linked directly to the account she had stolen from me. She tapped it against the crystal payment terminal with a sharp clack. The machine processed for a second. Then it let out a sharp negative buzz. The screen flashed bright red. Transaction declined. The cashier blinked, maintaining her professional composure. "I apologize, madame, but the card has been declined. Perhaps you would like to try inserting it with the chip." Courtney rolled her eyes so hard I am surprised she did not lose her balance. "It is a premium account," she snapped. "There is nearly $1 million on it. Your machine is broken. Just run it again." The cashier politely inserted the chip. The terminal whirred, attempting to connect with the global banking network. Again, the sharp buzz echoed through the quiet, luxurious boutique. The red text appeared, but this time the cashier's expression shifted. A small code appeared on her side of the screen. "Code 99. Seize card immediately. Contact local authorities." "I am very sorry," Madame the cashier said, her voice dropping an octave. "This card has a hard block on it from the issuing bank. I cannot return it to you." "Excuse me?" Courtney shrieked, her voice shattering the quiet ambiance of the store. Several wealthy patrons turned their heads to stare. "Give me my card back right now. Do you know how much money I make? You are completely incompetent. Let me speak to your manager." Brenda stepped forward, puffing out her chest. "You people have no idea who you are dealing with," my mother threatened, pointing a manicured finger at the cashier. "Run the card again or we will have your job." Before the cashier could respond, the boutique manager approached. He was a tall, impeccably dressed man named Monsieur Laurent. He had been observing the commotion from the floor. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his tone icy and calm. "Your cashier is trying to steal my premium card," Courtney yelled, slamming her hands on the glass counter. "She says it is declined." "That is impossible. I just transferred massive funds yesterday. Fix this right now." Monsieur Laurent glanced at the terminal screen. He saw the red seizure code. His demeanor shifted from customer service to absolute security protocol. "Madame," he said, his voice quiet but commanding. "The terminal does not lie. The bank has placed a severe restriction on this account. In these instances, the protocol requires us to retain the physical card and ask the customer to contact their financial institution. I must ask you to step away from the register." "This is an outrage," Brenda yelled. "You are discriminating against us because we are Americans. We are going to leave terrible reviews everywhere." "You are welcome to do so, Madame," Monsieur Laurent replied smoothly. "But you will not be taking these items and I will be keeping this card. Please lower your voice or I will have security escort you out of the boutique." Courtney was vibrating with rage and humiliation. The stares of the other customers burned into her back. She snatched her phone out of her purse, her fingers flying aggressively across the screen. She opened our text message thread. Back in my home office, my phone lit up on my desk. I picked it up and read the furious message from my sister. "Unlock your stupid card right now." The bank flagged it for travel because you did not set up the European notifications. I am trapped in a store, and they are trying to steal the card. Call the bank and fix this glitch immediately, or I swear I will make you regret it. I looked at the text. I imagined Courtney standing in one of the most expensive stores in the world, surrounded by things she thought she finally owned, throwing a toddler tantrum. I did not type out a long explanation. I did not argue. I simply typed a single devastating reply. I did not lock it. Interpol did. I hit send and placed the phone face down on my desk. Jamal watched me from his chair, a silent question in his eyes. I smiled at him. I think her shopping spree is officially over, I said. In Paris. Courtney stared at the glowing screen of her phone. The blood drained entirely from her face. The word Interpol sat there cold and absolute. She looked up at Monsieur Laurent, who was now subtly nodding to two large security guards standing near the entrance. Madame, Monsieur Laurent said, gesturing toward the heavy glass doors. I believe it is time for you to leave. Madame, Monsieur Laurent said, gesturing toward the heavy glass doors. I believe it is time for you to leave. Less than 2 minutes later, the glaring ringtone of an incoming FaceTime call shattered the silence of my home office. I glanced at the screen. The caller ID flashed with a picture of my mother, Brenda. I did not decline the call. I tapped the green accept button and propped the phone up against my monitor so Jamal could see the screen. Brenda's face filled the display, her expression twisted into an ugly mask of pure outrage. Behind her, the sunny tree-lined sidewalks of the Champs-Élysées blurred as she marched furiously down the street. Courtney was trailing closely behind her, frantically swiping at her own phone, her face flushed with humiliation. Natalie, fix this glitch immediately, my mother ordered, not bothering with a greeting. Her voice was shrill, completely disregarding the pedestrians passing by her in Paris. Do you have any idea how embarrassing that was? That arrogant French manager practically threw us out of the store. Call your bank right now and authorize the card. You are ruining our afternoon. I leaned back in my chair, folding my arms. I am not calling anyone Mom, I said calmly, and it is not a glitch. The account is frozen. Brenda stopped walking. The camera shook as she adjusted her grip on her phone, glaring into the lens. Stop throwing a childish tantrum, Natalie. She scolded, her tone shifting to that familiar condescending cadence she had used to control me my entire life. You have plenty of money. Courtney has had an incredibly difficult year dealing with Jamal and his lack of ambition. She is exhausted. She deserves a European reset. She needs this luxury to heal. It is the least you can do to support your sister. Stop being so selfish and unlock the funds. I glanced over at Jamal. He was sitting perfectly still, his fists clenched tight on his knees, listening to his mother-in-law casually diagnose his marriage as the reason her golden child needed to steal a fortune. Selfish, I repeated, letting the word hang in the air for a moment. You mean like when I was 19 years old working 2 jobs to save for my college tuition, I had exactly $12,000 in my savings account. And when I went to the bank to get a cashier check for my first semester, the teller told me the balance was 0. Do you remember that, Mom? Do you remember taking my tuition money to pay off Courtney's credit card debt because she bought too many designer shoes? Brenda let out a sharp, dismissive laugh, rolling her eyes on the screen. Oh, for heaven's sake, are you really bringing up ancient history? We are family. Natalie, I birthed you, I raised you, I put clothes on your back and food in your stomach. Anything you have under my roof or in your bank account is technically mine anyway. That is how family works. I am entitled to my daughter's assets when the family needs them. Courtney needed the money then, and she needs the money now. You owe us this. The sheer delusion was almost breathtaking. She honestly believed that giving birth to me gave her a permanent, irrevocable license to rob me blind whenever she saw fit. She felt zero remorse. She felt entitled to the fruits of my labor and, by extension, Jamal's labor. I am not fixing the card, I said, my voice dropping to a cool, flat register. Because I cannot fix it. The bank did not freeze the account because I asked them to. They froze it because you flagged a high-priority international alert. Brenda scoffed, waving her hand at the camera. Do not lie to me. You are just being spiteful because you are jealous of your sister. You have always been jealous of her. Now pick up the phone, call the fraud department, and tell them the $860,000 is yours and that you authorized the transfer to your mother. Tell them it is your personal savings. I leaned closer to the camera, making sure she could see the absolute lack of emotion in my eyes. I cannot tell them that, Mom, I replied softly. And why not? Brenda snapped, her patience completely gone. Because that was not my money, Mom, I said. The words hung in the digital space between us. Brenda's scowl faltered for a fraction of a second. The arrogant fire in her eyes dimmed, replaced by a sudden flickering spark of confusion. On the screen, Courtney stopped walking and looked over her mother's shoulder, her brow furrowed. What are you talking about? Brenda demanded, her voice losing its commanding edge. Whose money is it? Before I could answer, my secondary monitor lit up with a blinding red notification. The federal alert had escalated. The system was now locking down every domestic asset tied to their names. I looked from the warning screen back to the FaceTime call. The real consequences were about to begin. I did not bother answering my mother. I reached out and tapped the red button to end the FaceTime call, cutting off Brenda mid-sentence. The silence in my office was immediate, contrasting sharply with the blaring visual alarms on my monitors. The red notification banner pulsed on the screen, indicating that the $860,000 wire had officially been intercepted by European authorities. The French Financial Intelligence Unit had flagged the routing numbers and locked the funds in a holding account. The trap had closed entirely. Jamal stood up from the leather guest chair. He walked over to my desk and stared at the pulsing red light on the screen. He watched the lines of code scroll past, detailing the immediate domestic asset freeze being placed on Courtney and Brenda. He saw the automated notices being generated, dispatching federal agents to their known addresses. For years, I had watched Jamal absorb Courtney's verbal abuse. I had seen her roll her eyes when he came home exhausted from saving lives, complaining that he smelled like hospital bleach instead of expensive cologne. I had watched her ignore their two young boys to scroll through designer catalogs, treating motherhood like a massive inconvenience. He had always taken it with his head down, trying to keep the peace. But looking at that screen, seeing the undeniable proof that his wife had abandoned him and stolen his children's future, something inside him finally snapped. The tired, overworked paramedic was gone. In his place was a father who realized he needed to build a fortress around his kids. Can I use your phone? Jamal asked. His voice was completely devoid of the panic that had consumed him just an hour earlier. It was low, steady, and dangerous. I pointed to the black, secure landline on my desk. It is an encrypted line, I told him. Nobody can listen in, and it does not leave a public billing record. Who are you calling? He picked up the receiver and began dialing a number from memory. A divorce attorney. He stated simply, I treated a man in the back of my ambulance a few months ago who was having a panic attack over his bitter divorce. He gave me his card and told me he was the most ruthless family law attorney in the state. I kept it in my wallet because I always knew this day was coming. I just did not know she would go out in a blaze of federal crimes. Jamal pressed the phone to his ear. I watched as his posture straightened. He did not look like a victim anymore. He looked like a man taking back control of his life. Yes, I need to speak to Mr. Harrison Cole, immediately, Jamal said into the receiver. This is an emergency. My name is Jamal, and I am calling about filing an ex parte emergency custody order. There was a brief pause as he was transferred. I pulled up the asset freeze documentation on my screen, highlighting the joint accounts Courtney had drained that morning. I printed the ledger, the timestamp of her flight, and the federal alert codes, sliding the warm paper across the desk toward him. Mr. Cole, Jamal continued, his tone all business. My wife just abandoned our two children, drained our joint bank accounts, and fled the country to Paris. But that is not the worst part. She transferred those funds using a stolen digital security token linked to an active federal investigation. She is currently being targeted by Interpol and the FBI for international wire fraud and money laundering. Her domestic assets are being frozen as we speak. I need sole legal and physical custody of my sons drafted and filed with a judge before the end of the day. I could hear the faint, sharp voice of the attorney on the other end of the line, clearly taken aback, but immediately engaged. Jamal grabbed a pen from my desk and started jotting down notes on the back of the printed ledger I had handed him. Yes, I have documented proof of her flight and the stolen funds, Jamal confirmed. My sister-in-law is a forensic accountant working with federal agencies. She is sitting right next to me. The authorities are already moving on my wife in Europe. If I do not separate myself and my children from her, immediately Child Protective Services might get involved when the federal indictment drops. I need a financial restraining order to stop her from taking out any debt in my name, and I need the divorce papers drafted today. I want her completely removed from my property deed. Jamal listened for another minute, nodding sharply. I will be at your office in 20 minutes, he said, and hung up the receiver. He looked at me, taking a deep, steadying breath. The crushing weight of his toxic marriage was finally gone, replaced by the sharp adrenaline of a man going to war for his family. He carefully folded the printed papers from my desk and placed them into his pocket. Let her stay in Paris, he said firmly, his eyes locking onto mine with absolute resolve. She is never stepping foot in my house again. Let her stay in Paris, he said firmly, his eyes locking onto mine with absolute resolve. She is never stepping foot in my house again. While Jamal was taking back his freedom in my home office, the sun was beginning to set over the Seine in Paris. The golden hour light poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the opulent suite at the Ritz. Courtney and Brenda were trying to recover from their humiliating expulsion from the boutique. They were draped across the plush velvet sofas, sipping complimentary hotel wine because their room service privileges had mysteriously been suspended an hour earlier. Courtney aggressively tapped the screen of her phone, trying to log into any of her secondary credit cards. She grumbled about how I was going to pay for this temporary inconvenience. Brenda was busy adjusting her silk robe, assuring Courtney that I was just throwing a childish tantrum and that everything would be sorted out by morning. They had convinced themselves that they were untouchable. They believed the worst thing that could happen was a ruined shopping trip. Their delusion was shattered by a sudden thunderous pounding on the heavy double doors of their suite. It was not the gentle tap of a hotel concierge. It was a tactical, authoritative knock that vibrated through the floorboards. Before Courtney could even set her wine glass down, the door flew open. 6 heavily armed officers from the French Gendarmerie Nationale swarmed into the room, their tactical boots sinking into the thick Persian rug. They were followed immediately by 2 plainclothes Europol agents wearing dark suits and serious expressions. Courtney shrieked and jumped to her feet, dropping her wine glass. It shattered against the marble floor, splashing dark red liquid across the pristine white baseboards. Brenda grabbed her chest, gasping for air, as the armed officers quickly secured the perimeter of the sprawling suite. "What is the meaning of this?" Brenda screamed, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "We are American citizens. You cannot just barge into our room. We paid for this suite." A tall, sharp-featured Europol agent stepped forward. He held up a leather wallet displaying a silver badge. He did not look angry. He looked entirely indifferent, which was far more terrifying. "Madam," the agent said in flawless, unaccented English, "you are currently in possession of funds belonging to an international criminal syndicate transferred via unauthorized access to a United States federal server. You are both under arrest for international wire fraud, money laundering, and grand larceny." Courtney let out a sharp, hysterical laugh. She crossed her arms, trying to summon the same entitled energy she had used on the retail workers earlier that day. "This is a massive mistake," she snapped, stepping toward the agent. "My sister is just an accountant. She is playing a sick joke on us. I demand you leave this room immediately. I know my rights. I have diplomatic immunity. I am calling the United States Embassy right now, and you will all lose your jobs." The Europol agent stared at her for a long, quiet moment. Then he gave a slight dismissive nod to the French officers. "Secure the evidence," he ordered. The room erupted into organized chaos. Two officers grabbed the designer shopping bags Courtney had managed to acquire before the freeze. Another officer moved directly to the bedside table and snatched Brenda's passport and wallet. "Hey, give that back!" Brenda yelled, lunging forward. A French officer instantly stepped in her path, holding up a stern hand to stop her. Courtney desperately unlocked her phone, her fingers trembling as she tried to dial international numbers. An officer stepped behind her, swiftly plucking the device right out of her hands. He dropped it into a static-proof plastic evidence bag. She screamed in protest, reaching for the bag, but the officer firmly grasped her wrist and twisted her arm behind her back. "You cannot do this," Courtney wailed, her confident facade entirely crumbling as the cold metal of handcuffs snapped tightly around her wrists. "We are victims here. My sister set us up. Call the embassy. Call the American ambassador." The lead agent picked up Courtney's passport from the desk and flipped through it. "The United States Embassy has already been notified of your apprehension," he stated calmly. "They are the ones who provided us with your exact coordinates. You do not have diplomatic immunity. You have a federal indictment waiting for you in New York." Brenda began to sob uncontrollably as her own wrists were bound behind her back. The luxurious Parisian vacation she had bragged about mere hours ago was evaporating before her eyes. The officers marched them out of the suite. They were paraded down the grand crystal chandelier-lit hallways of the Ritz, past horrified wealthy guests and whispering hotel staff. There was no glamour left. There was only the harsh, humiliating reality of federal justice. While my mother and sister were being paraded through the lobby of the Ritz, the sun was still shining brightly over my quiet suburban neighborhood in the United States. I had just finished logging the final incident report on my secure terminal when a heavy, authoritative knock echoed from my front door. It was the exact same rhythm that had just shattered my sister's Parisian fantasy. 2 solid strikes, a pause, and 2 more. Jamal had already left to meet with his divorce attorney, so the house was empty. I walked down the hallway, my footsteps muffled by the runner rug. I glanced through the peephole. Standing on my porch were 2 men. They wore sharp navy suits, mirrored sunglasses, and dark windbreakers with the bright yellow letters FBI printed across the back. One of them rested his hand casually near his holstered weapon. It looked exactly like the kind of raid you see on evening television, the kind where the suspect is dragged away in cuffs. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open. The taller agent stepped forward, his expression carved from stone. "Natalie," he said, his voice deep and entirely humorless. "We detected a massive security breach originating from your terminal. An international wire transfer utilizing your classified clearance codes was executed this morning." I did not flinch or beg for a lawyer. Instead, I leaned against the doorframe and offered a relaxed smile. "You are 30 minutes late, Thomas," I said. "I expected you guys to be here the second the Europol alert triggered." The stony expression on the lead agent's face instantly dissolved into a tired grin. He took off his mirrored sunglasses and shook his head. "Traffic on the interstate was a nightmare," he replied, stepping inside as I moved aside. "Plus, we had to coordinate the apprehension team in France. Your sister put up quite a fight at the hotel. She actually demanded to speak to the ambassador. I led Special Agent Thomas Reynolds and his partner into my home office. Thomas had been my direct handler for 3 years. We had spent hundreds of hours tracing cartel money through offshore shell companies. He knew I would never compromise an active investigation. But federal protocol was strict. An unauthorized transfer of $860,000 required unquestionable proof that the agent in charge was not complicit. "Have a seat," I told them. "I assume you need the physical evidence for the indictment file before the higher-ups start breathing down your neck." Thomas pulled out a small digital recorder and set it on my desk. "You know the drill, Natalie. We need absolute confirmation that you were not the one who authorized the wire, and we need to verify how your security tokens were compromised. If we cannot prove they acted alone, the defense attorneys will try to drag you down with them." I opened the top drawer of my desk and pulled out a sleek encrypted USB drive. I tossed it across the desk. Thomas caught it effortlessly. You will find the complete 4K security footage on that drive, I explained, crossing my arms. I have hidden cameras covering every entry point of this house, including a micro lens positioned directly above the wall safe in my guest bedroom. The timestamp corresponds exactly with the moment I was scanning my membership card at the local gym. Thomas plugged the drive into his secure tablet. The three of us watched the high-definition footage play out. The video clearly showed Brenda and Courtney letting themselves in through the back door using the spare key Brenda had secretly copied. The audio was crystal clear. Courtney was complaining about the heat while Brenda confidently marched straight to the hidden wall safe. On the screen, Brenda bypassed the mechanical lock, retrieving the physical authentication token. Then they moved to my computer. Courtney plugged the token in, fully aware of what she was doing, while Brenda stood behind her, encouraging her to take every single penny. The footage captured their faces, voices, and clear intent to commit grand larceny and wire fraud. Thomas paused the video and pulled the drive from his tablet. He looked at me, shaking his head. I have seen a lot of greedy criminals in my career, Natalie, but your own mother facilitating a federal crime to fund a vacation is a new low. This footage is airtight. You are completely cleared of any suspicion. He stood up, signaling the end of the official visit. Be prepared, he warned, his tone turning serious again. They are being processed at the French precinct right now. They are entitled to a phone call. When they realize the embassy is not coming to save them, they are going to call the only person they think they can still manipulate. I walked them back to the front door. Let them call, I said coldly. I have a lot of things left to say. Just as my hand reached for the brass handle of the front door to let the agents out, the shrill ringtone of my personal cell phone pierced the quiet of the hallway. I pulled the phone from my pocket and looked at the glowing screen. The caller ID displayed a long string of numbers indicating an international call from France. Thomas stopped in his tracks, his hand hovering over his holster. He exchanged a knowing glance with his partner. Looks like we are not leaving just yet, Thomas said softly. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled the digital audio recorder back out, clicking the red button. Put her on speakerphone, Natalie. Let us hear what she has to say. I walked back into the living room and set the phone flat on the glass coffee table. I pressed the green accept button and tapped the speaker icon. I did not say hello. I just let the line open. For a moment, all I heard was the hollow, echoing sound of a large, concrete room. Muffled voices speaking rapid French chattered in the background. Then came the unmistakable sound of heavy, breathless sobbing. Natalie, Brenda wailed, her voice cracking with pure panic and desperation. Natalie, please tell me you are there. Please pick up the phone. I am here, Mom. I replied, my voice perfectly level. Thomas leaned over the table, holding the recorder close to the phone speaker. Oh, thank God, Brenda cried out. Her words were tumbling over each other in a frantic rush. Natalie, you have to fix this right now. It is a complete nightmare. These foreign police officers burst into our hotel room like we were terrorists. They put handcuffs on your sister. They dragged us out in front of the entire lobby. They threw me in a freezing cold holding cell, and they took all of my things. You need to call the embassy immediately and tell them this is all a massive misunderstanding. I crossed my arms and stared down at the phone. A misunderstanding, I repeated slowly. What exactly is the misunderstanding, Mom? Brenda let out a frustrated gasp, clearly annoyed that I was not immediately rushing to her rescue. The money, Natalie. The bank account. You need to tell these people that you gave us permission to transfer those funds. They are treating us like common criminals. Courtney is in the next room crying her eyes out because they confiscated her new bags and her passport. Just tell them you authorized the wire transfer so they can let us go back to the hotel. I looked at Thomas. He gave me a subtle nod, gesturing for me to keep her talking. The more she spoke, the tighter she tied her own noose. I cannot tell them I authorized the transfer, Mom, because I did not, I said calmly. You broke into my house while I was at the gym. I am your mother. Brenda shrieked defensively, her fear momentarily masked by her towering entitlement. I did not break in. I used the spare key you hid under the flower pot. I have every right to enter your home. And I had every right to take that money. You were just hoarding it. $860,000 just sitting in a file on your computer while your sister is suffocating in a miserable marriage with a man who cannot even afford to buy her a decent car. We needed that money. So you admit you bypassed my secure terminal? I asked, keeping my tone inquisitive rather than accusatory. Of course I did, she snapped, her voice echoing loudly in the French precinct. You made it incredibly difficult. We had to dig through your closet to find that little metal security drive just to get into the folder you labeled as your personal savings. You were being completely selfish by hiding it from your family. I just took what we were owed. Now stop playing these games, call whoever you need to call and clear this up. I am tired, I am cold, and I want to go sleep in the bed I paid for. Thomas was smiling now. He shook his head in absolute disbelief. She had just confessed to breaking and entering unauthorized access to a protected computer system and grand larceny, all on a recorded federal line. She had articulated her exact method of bypassing the security token, leaving zero room for her to claim ignorance or mistake. She had handed the Department of Justice a wrapped gift. Mom, I said, leaning closer to the phone, you did not take my savings. That money was evidence in an active federal investigation. You stole cartel money from the United States government, and the agents investigating that theft are standing in my living room right now, listening to everything you just said. The line went dead silent. The sound of Brenda breathing hitched in her throat. Natalie, what are you? Brenda started, her voice suddenly small and trembling with a new profound terror. Enjoy the concrete bed, Mom, I said. I tapped the red button, cutting her off mid-sentence, and the room was quiet once again. Enjoy the concrete bed, Mom, I said. I tapped the red button, cutting her off mid-sentence, and the room was quiet once again. While I wrapped up my meeting with the federal agents, Jamal was walking into the sleek glass-enclosed lobby of Harrison Cole Family Law. The firm was located on the top floor of a downtown high-rise, exuding the ruthless energy Jamal desperately needed. He was still wearing his paramedic scrubs, a stark contrast to the tailored suits rushing past him, but he walked with his head held high. A receptionist immediately escorted him into a massive corner office overlooking the city. Harrison Cole was a shark in a three-piece suit. He stood up from behind his massive mahogany desk and shook Jamal's hand with a firm, assessing grip. Jamal did not waste any time. He sat down and pulled the printed ledgers and federal alert codes I had given him from his pocket, spreading them across the polished wood. Before we get into the criminal element, Mr. Cole said, adjusting his glasses as he opened a file folder with Jamal's name on it. I had my paralegal run a rapid background check on your joint assets. I need you to brace yourself, Jamal. Your wife did not just drain the checking and savings accounts. Jamal leaned forward, his jaw tightening. What else did she do? She took out a secret second mortgage on your family home 3 months ago, Cole stated flatly, sliding a piece of paper across the desk. She forged your digital signature on the equity line of credit to pull out $150,000. That money was funneled directly into a credit account under her name, only, which she maxed out on luxury goods and plane tickets before fleeing the country. Jamal stared at the forged signature. A year ago, this massive financial revelation would have completely broken him. He would have agonized over how to pay it back, how to work a third job, and how to fix her massive mess. Now, staring at the paper, he felt absolutely nothing but a cold, calculated clarity. She can keep the debt, Jamal said, his voice dropping to a gravelly register. Because she is not coming back. Look at the papers I brought you. Cole picked up the printouts I had provided. His eyes scanned the routing numbers, the federal flags, and the time-stamped Europol arrest confirmation. The seasoned family law attorney actually paused for a moment. He looked up at Jamal, genuinely impressed. Your wife stole almost $1 million of federal honeypot funds, Cole asked, raising an eyebrow. She triggered the Patriot Act to go on a shopping spree in Paris. Yes, Jamal replied. And she is currently sitting in a French holding cell waiting to be extradited by the United States Marshals. My sister-in-law is the forensic accountant managing the stolen funds. The federal government is seizing all of Courtney's domestic assets as we speak. I need my children protected from the fallout immediately. I want sole physical and legal custody, and I want her name stripped from my property. Cole did not hesitate for a single second. He pressed a button on his intercom, ordering his team to draft the emergency ex parte orders immediately. Within an hour, they were walking into the county courthouse. Because of the severity of the federal crimes and the immediate flight risk involved, the family court judge granted an emergency hearing right in his chambers. The judge took one look at the Europol apprehension documents and the FBI asset freeze notices. He did not ask a single question about Courtney's fitness as a mother. The evidence of grand larceny, international wire fraud, and child abandonment was overwhelming. With the stroke of a pen, the judge granted Jamal immediate sole legal and physical custody of his two boys. He signed a secondary order locking Courtney out of the marital home and freezing any remaining domestic lines of credit tied to her name. By late afternoon, Jamal pulled his truck into his own driveway. The autumn sun was casting long shadows over the front lawn. His two young sons were safely inside watching cartoons in the living room, completely unaware of the disaster their mother had tried to rain down on them. Standing on the front porch was a local locksmith drilling out the brass deadbolt of the front door. Jamal watched closely as the heavy metal cylinder fell out into the tired worker's hand. A brand new heavy-duty lock was installed in its place. The locksmith handed Jamal a set of shiny new keys. Jamal tightly closed his hand around the cold metal. He listened to the sound of his boys laughing through the living room window. His own house was secure. His children were safe. His toxic, entitled wife was 6,000 miles away, locked in a foreign cage, and she would never have a key to his life ever again. His toxic, entitled wife was 6,000 miles away, locked in a foreign cage, and she would never have a key to his life ever again. 6,000 miles away, the reality of that cage was setting in. Courtney sat shivering in a sterile, windowless interrogation room deep inside the French police headquarters. The designer silk robe she had flaunted on the internet had been confiscated as evidence. She was now wearing a stiff, oversized paper jumpsuit. The harsh fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, illuminating the stark metal table bolted to the concrete floor. The heavy steel door swung open. The same tall Europol agent from the hotel entered carrying a thick manila folder. He sat across from her, his face devoid of any sympathy. He opened the folder and spread out several glossy photographs and bank statements. "I demand my phone," Courtney said, her voice shaking but still laced with her usual entitlement. "I have been sitting in this freezing room for hours. You have absolutely no right to treat American citizens this way. Call the embassy immediately." The agent folded his hands over the files. "The United States Embassy has officially declined to intervene on your behalf," he stated in a flat tone. "They were provided with the evidence of your financial crimes. Your government is currently preparing your extradition paperwork." Courtney scoffed, though her eyes darted nervously. "What financial crimes?" "My mother and I transferred my sister's personal savings. It is a family dispute. Natalie is throwing a hysterical fit because she is jealous. You are making a massive mistake." The agent picked up a photograph and slid it across the metal table. It was a surveillance image of a heavily tattooed man being escorted into a federal courthouse. "Does this man look like your sister?" the agent asked. Courtney stared at the photo, her brow furrowed in genuine confusion. "I have no idea who that is," she snapped. "That is Hector Salazar," the agent replied smoothly. "He is a high-ranking lieutenant for a major international drug cartel. The money you stole this morning, the $860,000, belonged to his syndicate. It was seized by the United States Department of Justice 3 weeks ago. Your sister is a forensic accountant who manages those seized assets for the federal government. You did not steal her personal savings. You hacked into a classified federal server and wired cartel money across international borders." The remaining color drained entirely from Courtney's face. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. The walls of the tiny concrete room seemed to close in around her. You are facing charges for grand larceny, unauthorized access to a protected government system, identity theft, and international wire fraud, the agent continued. Because you moved the funds across international borders, you violated the Patriot Act. The mandatory minimum sentence for these federal crimes is 15 years in a maximum security prison. 15 years. Courtney whispered, her voice cracking into a squeal. No, that is impossible. I am a mother, I have a husband, I live in a nice neighborhood. I do not belong in a prison. You have to believe me. I did not know it was government money. Ignorance of the origin of the funds does not negate the act of stealing them, the agent replied coldly. We have the surveillance footage from your sister's house showing you plugging the security token into the computer. Courtney began to hyperventilate. The arrogant facade completely shattered, leaving behind a terrified, desperate woman who realized her entire life was over. Her survival instinct kicked in. The instinct she had honed her entire life by stepping on everyone around her. It was my mother, Courtney blurted out, her voice echoing shrilly off the concrete walls. Brenda forced me to do it. The agent raised an eyebrow, picking up his pen. Go on, he instructed. I am just a victim of her manipulation, Courtney cried, tears streaming down her face as she rapidly constructed her lie. She stole the spare key to Natalie's house. She is the one who knew where the safe was hidden. She told me Natalie owed us that money. She stood right behind me and ordered me to type in the transfer codes. I told her it was a bad idea, but she would not listen. She masterminded the entire thing to pay for her luxury vacation. You cannot send me to prison for something my mother forced me to do. She is the real criminal here. The agent did not show a shred of emotion as he wrote down her frantic confession. He knew she was lying, but this massive betrayal would make prosecuting them both incredibly easy. He looked up at her with a chilling, calculated gaze. While Courtney tried to sell her own mother out, Brenda was in the adjacent room putting on a different performance. She paced the length of her tiny holding cell, loudly demanding to speak to someone in charge. Every time a French officer walked past the barred window, she shouted that her rights were being violated. She demanded a phone, a lawyer, and a United States consular officer. She was convinced that once an American official arrived, this mix-up would be swept under the rug. She was a respectable suburban mother, not a hardened criminal. The heavy metal door finally unlocked. Brenda stopped pacing and crossed her arms, adopting her authoritative posture. A man walked into the room wearing a tailored charcoal suit and carrying a slim leather briefcase. He had the exhausted look of a bureaucrat who had spent entirely too much time dealing with arrogant tourists. It is about time, Brenda snapped. My daughter and I have been unlawfully detained by these foreign police officers. I demand that you secure our immediate release. We have a flight back to New York to catch, and I expect the embassy to compensate us for the confiscated luxury items. The man did not smile. He placed his briefcase on the table and clicked the latches open. My name is Mr. Carter, he said. I am a consular officer representing the United States Embassy in Paris. But I am not here to secure your release. I am here to serve you. He pulled a thick stack of documents from his briefcase and slid them across the table. They were printed on heavy legal paper bearing the undeniable seal of the United States Department of Justice. What is this? Brenda asked, her facade slipping as she looked at the official seals. I told you I need a lawyer and a flight home. I do not need more paperwork. Those are your formal extradition papers, Mr. Carter explained evenly. The United States government is requesting that the French Republic hand you and your daughter over to the United States Marshals Service. You are not going home on a commercial flight. You are going back to American soil in handcuffs on a federal transport plane. Brenda stared at the papers, her breathing becoming rapid. Extradition, she repeated. You cannot do that. We just transferred some family money. Natalie is just angry. She can drop the charges. Natalie has no power to drop these charges, Mr. Carter replied, tapping the top page of the document. Because Natalie is not the one charging you. The federal government is charging you. You are officially indicted for international wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and conspiracy to commit money laundering. You stole hundreds of thousands of dollars of flagged government evidence. The embassy does not bail out citizens who commit federal crimes against the United States. We facilitate their return to face the justice system. Brenda sank into the metal chair bolted to the floor. Her knees could no longer support her weight. The reality of the situation was finally piercing through her thick layer of delusion. But Courtney, she stammered, her voice dropping to a fragile whisper. Courtney is a mother. She is a good girl. She just wanted a nice vacation. You cannot send my daughter to a federal prison. She would not survive it. She needs her luxury. She needs her comforts. Mr. Carter closed his briefcase. Your daughter is currently in the next room giving a fully documented confession to Europol, he stated coldly. And just so you are fully aware of the situation you are in, she has officially stated that you masterminded the entire operation. She claims you forced her to steal the security token and execute the wire transfer against her will. She is attempting to leverage your involvement for a reduced sentence. Brenda sat frozen. The words hit her harder than any physical blow could have. She had spent her entire life coddling Courtney. She had stolen from me, lied to Jamal, and alienated the rest of the world just to make sure her golden child had everything she ever wanted. And at the very first sign of real trouble, Courtney had not hesitated for a single second to throw her directly to the wolves. The silence in the interrogation room was absolute. Mr. Carter turned and walked toward the door, leaving the extradition papers sitting on the cold metal table. The realization finally settled over Brenda, like a heavy, suffocating blanket. There was no embassy rescue, there was no bailout. Her golden child was going to federal prison, and she was dragging her mother down with her. She was completely trapped in a nightmare of her own making with no escape. There was no embassy rescue. There was no bailout. Her golden child was going to federal prison, and she was dragging her mother down with her. She was completely trapped in a nightmare of her own making with no escape. News travels incredibly fast in a family built on gossip. Brenda had apparently used her one permitted phone call from the French holding cell to contact her older sister, my Aunt Susan. Aunt Susan had always been the chief enabler of the extended family. She was the one who always praised Courtney for her expensive taste and told me I needed to dress better if I ever wanted to be as successful as my sister. Within 30 minutes of Brenda making that call, my phone began to vibrate violently across the surface of my desk. It started with a barrage of text messages, followed immediately by missed calls and voicemails. The family group chat, ironically titled Family First, was suddenly flooded with notifications. I picked up my phone and watched the messages roll in a digital avalanche of misplaced outrage. How could you do this to your own mother, Aunt Susan wrote, attaching an angry red face emoji. She called me from a freezing jail cell, crying her eyes out. You call the police right now and tell them it was a mistake. Uncle David chimed in a second later. You are an absolute monster, Natalie. Courtney has incredibly high anxiety. She cannot handle being locked up in a foreign country. You are tearing this family apart over a simple financial misunderstanding. Drop the charges immediately. The messages kept coming, each one more venomous than the last. They accused me of being vindictive. They claimed I was jealous of Courtney's beauty and lifestyle. They said I had orchestrated this entire scenario just to humiliate them. Not a single person asked if I was okay. Not a single person asked how Jamal and the children were doing after waking up completely penniless. To my extended family, Courtney and Brenda were the undisputed victims, and I was the villain who refused to share my toys. My phone rang in my hand. It was Aunt Susan. I let it go straight to voicemail. A minute later, I played the message out loud. Listen to me, Natalie. Aunt Susan snapped, her voice trembling with self-righteous fury. Jamal is a grown man. If Courtney needed to borrow some money to take a mental health break, he can work a few extra shifts at the hospital to make it up. That is what husbands do. You have absolutely no right to involve the federal government in family business. If you do not fix this by tonight, you are dead to us. We will disown you. I listened to the recording twice. The absolute disregard for Jamal's humanity was staggering. They viewed my hard-working, exhausted brother-in-law as nothing more than a beast of burden meant to finance Courtney's delusions. I did not type out a long emotional defense. I did not waste my breath arguing with people committed to misunderstanding me. Instead, I opened my email and downloaded the preliminary federal charge sheet that Agent Thomas Reynolds had forwarded to me for my records. Next, I downloaded the emergency custody and asset freeze filings Jamal had just secured from the family court judge. Using my editing software, I merged the documents into a single devastating PDF file. I used a bright yellow digital highlighter to emphasize the most damning paragraphs. I highlighted the exact dollar amount Courtney had stolen from her own children's college fund. I highlighted the forensic evidence proving she had forged Jamal's digital signature to secretly take out a second mortgage on their family home. Finally, I highlighted the section of the federal indictment detailing her attempt to blame the entire criminal enterprise on her own mother. I opened the raging family group chat. The unread message count was climbing past 50, filled with threats of disownment and insults about my character. I attached the highlighted PDF file and hit send. Underneath the file, I typed a single simple sentence. Read exactly what you are defending before you ever speak to me again. I leaned back in my chair and watched the screen. The flurry of incoming text messages stopped instantly. The chat went completely still. Below my message, the tiny circular icons of my aunts, uncles, and cousins began to pop up as they opened the document. The red receipts registered one by one. I sat there in the quiet of my office watching the digital silence stretch on. For years, these people had enabled Brenda and Courtney's toxic behavior. They had cheered on the golden child while ignoring the trail of destruction she left behind. Now they were staring at undeniable legal proof that their precious Courtney was a sociopath who planned to leave her husband bankrupt and her children homeless. They were staring at proof that she had sold out her own mother to save herself. 5 minutes passed, then 10 minutes. Not a single person typed a reply. No apologies were offered, but no more insults were thrown. The loud, abusive echo chamber of my extended family had finally been suffocated by the cold, hard weight of the truth. The enablers had fallen completely silent, and I knew I would never hear from them again. The enablers had fallen completely silent, and I knew I would never hear from them again. By the next morning, the digital silence of my extended family was replaced by the harsh mechanical reality of federal asset forfeiture. Agent Thomas Reynolds sent me a brief encrypted text message just after my morning coffee. It contained a single address, my mother's address, and a timestamp for 9 o'clock. The Department of Justice was not waiting for Brenda and Courtney to land on American soil before securing collateral. They were moving in to seize assets equal to the stolen federal funds, plus potential fines. I grabbed my car keys. I was not going to miss this. I parked my sedan down the street from Brenda's house, slipping on a pair of sunglasses and rolling down the window to let the crisp autumn breeze in. My mother lived in a sprawling 2-story colonial house in a highly sought-after gated community. It had a perfectly manicured lawn, pristine white columns, and a heavy mahogany front door. For decades, this house had been Brenda's ultimate weapon. She used it to project an image of untouchable upper-class success, hosting lavish neighborhood parties, and looking down on anyone who lived in a smaller zip code. She had maintained this facade by drowning in secret credit card debt and constantly demanding financial bailouts from me under the guise of family duty. Right at 9 o'clock, the serene quiet of the wealthy cul-de-sac was shattered. 3 unmarked white cargo vans and a heavy-duty flatbed tow truck rolled past the iron neighborhood gates and pulled directly onto Brenda's immaculate stamped concrete driveway. Several men and women wearing dark windbreakers with the bright yellow letters IRS Criminal Investigation printed on the back stepped out. They were not there to ask questions. They had federal warrants signed by a judge authorizing the immediate seizure of property purchased with or acting as collateral for illicit funds. I watched as the lead agent walked up to the heavy mahogany door. He did not knock. He used a master lock bypass tool, and within seconds the front door swung wide open. The agents flooded into the house. Almost immediately, curtains in the neighboring houses began to twitch. The wealthy neighbors my mother had spent years trying to impress were now pressing their faces against the glass, watching her carefully constructed empire crumble in real time. 10 minutes later, the heavy-duty tow truck backed up dangerously close to Brenda's prized possession. It was a brand-new pearl-white Mercedes-Benz luxury SUV. She had bought it 6 months ago, bragging to the entire family that she had finally treated herself to the car she deserved. I knew for a fact she had taken out a predatory loan to afford the payments, assuming she could eventually bully me into paying it off. Now, a burly operator in a high-visibility vest was crawling under the front bumper, attaching thick steel chains to the axle. The hydraulic winch whined loudly, echoing through the quiet neighborhood. I watched with profound satisfaction as the pearl-white Mercedes was dragged unceremoniously onto the flatbed truck. The tires squeaked against the metal ramp. The ultimate symbol of my mother's manufactured superiority was being hauled off to a federal impound lot to be auctioned off to the highest bidder. Inside the house, the dismantling continued. Agents began walking out the front door carrying clear plastic evidence bins. Through my binoculars, I could see exactly what was inside. There were stacks of velvet jewelry boxes containing the diamond necklaces and tennis bracelets Brenda had accumulated over the years. Another agent carried out armfuls of designer handbags, throwing them into the back of the white cargo van like they were cheap groceries. They were stripping the house to its bones, taking everything of value to satisfy the massive financial void my sister and mother had created when they stole from the government. Finally, the lead agent walked back out onto the front porch. He carried a staple gun and a bright fluorescent orange notice. It was a federal property lien. He stepped up to the beautiful mahogany door and slammed the staple gun directly into the expensive wood, securing the notice at eye level. The bright orange paper declared that the property was now under the control of the United States government. Brenda's sanctuary was gone. The house she had used to belittle others was now a monument to her greed. I started my car engine, taking one last look at the orange notice fluttering in the wind. The physical destruction of her fake wealth was complete. Now it was time for the emotional fallout. As I pulled away from the curb, my phone buzzed with a message from Jamal. Courtney had just used her one phone call from the French precinct to reach him, and he was ready for her. As I pulled away from the curb, my phone buzzed with a message from Jamal. Courtney had just used her one phone call from the French precinct to reach him, and he was ready for her. He had downloaded a call recording application the moment he left the courthouse, knowing exactly what kind of emotional blackmail she would attempt. He forwarded the audio file directly to my secure messaging app. I pulled my sedan into an empty parking lot, connected my phone to the Bluetooth system of my car, and pressed play. The pristine audio quality filled the cabin, capturing every nuance of my sister's desperation. "Jamal, thank God," Courtney's voice crackled through the speakers. She sounded frantic, her breath hitching, but underneath the panic, there was still that undeniable poisonous thread of entitlement. "Listen to me very carefully, because they only gave me 2 minutes. You need to call a top-tier federal defense attorney right now. Drain whatever you have left in your retirement account. Call your parents for a loan. I do not care what you have to do. Just get me a lawyer who can fix this nightmare." Jamal's voice came through the recording, steady, deep, and dangerously calm. "I cannot drain my retirement account, Courtney, because the federal government already froze every single asset connected to your social security number. Then borrow the money." Courtney shrieked, her polished mask completely slipping. "Jamal, I am sitting in a freezing concrete box. I am the mother of your children. You cannot let them grow up knowing their mother is locked in a federal prison. Think about the boys. They need me. You owe it to them to get me out of here. If you do not do this, you are destroying our family." There was a brief, heavy pause on the recording. When Jamal finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of years of suppressed anger, finally breaking free. "Think about the boys," Jamal repeated, his tone utterly devoid of any warmth. "You mean the boys whose college fund you wiped out yesterday morning?" The boys whose house you secretly mortgaged 3 months ago so you could buy designer bags. You did not think about them when you forged my signature on those bank documents. You did not think about them when you left them with exactly $10 in our checking account to fly first class to Paris. I was going to pay it back. She lied desperately, her voice pitching higher. It was an investment in my personal brand, and anyway, my mother forced me to do the wire transfer. She is the one who stole the keys. I am a victim here, Jamal. Stop talking, Jamal commanded, his voice cracking like a whip. For the last 10 years, I have listened to you talk down to me. I worked double shifts in the back of an ambulance scraping people off the pavement just so you could pretend you were born into high society. You called me a wage slave on the internet yesterday to thousands of strangers. But the absolute worst part was not how you treated me. It was how you treated my family. Courtney let out a confused, offended whimper. What are you talking about? I have always been perfectly polite to your family. You refused to let my mother attend Thanksgiving dinner last year. Jamal growled, his voice vibrating with absolute disgust. You told me her presence would ruin the aesthetic of your perfect suburban holiday. You made racist, passive-aggressive comments about my sister's natural hair every time she came over. You looked down on my entire family because we are hardworking Black Americans who did not have a trust fund. You treated my flesh and blood like they were beneath you while you were the one harboring the real trash inside. Pure greed. Jamal, please. Courtney sobbed, finally realizing her manipulation was failing entirely. Her leverage was gone. I am sorry, I was stressed. I will change, I promise. Just call a lawyer. I am your wife. Not anymore, Jamal stated coldly. I spent the entire afternoon at family court. I brought the Europol arrest records and the FBI asset forfeiture notices. The judge granted me emergency ex parte orders. I have sole physical and legal custody of the boys. You are legally locked out of the house. The locks have already been changed, and you have been served with divorce papers. They will be waiting for you when the United States Marshals drag you back to American soil. You cannot do this to me, Courtney screamed, the sound distorting the audio recording with pure rage. I will take the kids. I will take the house. You do not have a house, Jamal replied, delivering the final definitive blow. You do not have a husband, and you will never see my children unsupervised again. Enjoy your reset, Courtney. The sharp click of the line disconnecting echoed through my car speakers. Jamal had hung up on her. He had taken all the power she thought she held and crushed it into dust. I sat in the parking lot, resting my head against the steering wheel, and let out a long, slow breath. The golden child was finally completely alone. The golden child was finally completely alone. But her isolation was not geographic. 48 hours later, Courtney found herself sitting mere inches away from her mother. However, the emotional distance between them was an unbridgeable chasm. They were not flying back to the United States in the plush leather seats of a first-class cabin, sipping champagne and laughing at the wage slaves below. They were strapped into the rigid, unyielding metal benches of a United States Marshals Service transport plane. The aircraft was a stripped-down Boeing 737 devoid of any commercial comforts. There were no windows in the passenger hold, no flight attendants, and certainly no complimentary meals. The air inside the cabin was freezing and smelled strongly of aviation fuel and stale sweat. Courtney and Brenda were dressed in heavy, bright orange jumpsuits. Their wrists were locked in heavy steel handcuffs connected to a thick chain wrapped securely around their waists. Their ankles were shackled together, making even the smallest movement a painful, humiliating chore. The deafening roar of the jet engines made it difficult to speak, but the absolute hatred radiating between the two women was louder than the machinery. The alliance they had built on a foundation of entitlement and greed had completely disintegrated the moment the Europol agent mentioned a 15-year sentence. "This is entirely your fault," Courtney hissed, leaning as far away from her mother as the heavy chains would allow. She stared down at her bruised wrists, her meticulously manicured nails now chipped and dirty. If you had not copied Natalie's house key, we would not be in this flying tin can. You ruined my life. Jamal is divorcing me. He took my children. I have absolutely nothing left because I listened to your stupid plan. Brenda snapped her head toward her daughter, her eyes burning with a venom she had previously reserved exclusively for me. Do not you dare play the innocent victim with me, you ungrateful little brat. Brenda spat back, her voice harsh and raspy from crying in the French holding cell. I read the transcript of your confession. You told the investigators I forced you to do it. You tried to sell your own mother up the river to save your own skin after you happily spent $40,000 on designer bags. I was trying to survive. Courtney yelled, her voice echoing over the drone of the engines. You have already lived your life. You are old, I am young. I have a family to get back to. You should have taken the fall for me. That is what a real mother would do. A United States Marshal standing near the bulkhead turned and glared at them, resting his hand on his utility belt. Keep it down back there, he ordered sharply. You are federal inmates now, not passengers on a cruise ship. Brenda flinched at the harsh command, but the anger bubbling inside her could not be contained. She lowered her voice to a vicious whisper. A real mother, she scoffed. I spent my entire life giving you everything you wanted. I stole your sister's college tuition so you could buy clothes. I made her pay your rent. I mortgaged my own future so you could pretend to be wealthy. And the second you faced a single consequence, you threw me to the wolves without a second thought. You are a selfish, hollow, pathetic woman. Courtney let out a bitter, mocking laugh. I am selfish. You taught me how to be this way. You taught me that Natalie existed only to serve us. You convinced me that we were untouchable. Now look at us. We are chained to a bench eating dry bologna sandwiches from brown paper bags. My husband changed the locks on my house. My friends are probably reading about my federal indictment in the news right now. You built this fake empire, Mom, and you dragged me right down with it. The plane hit a pocket of severe turbulence, dropping suddenly. Both women gasped, their heavy chains rattling loudly against the metal floor. The physical discomfort was agonizing, but the psychological torture was far worse. For the first time in their lives, they were stripped of all their defenses. There was no one left to manipulate. There was no one left to blame. They sat in suffocating silence for the remainder of the 8-hour flight. The cold steel of the shackles bit into their skin with every jolt of the aircraft. They did not look at each other again. The toxic bond that had united them in their cruelty toward me was permanently broken. They had chased a fantasy of unearned luxury all the way to Paris, only to fly back to reality as despised, chained adversaries destined for a concrete cage. They had chased a fantasy of unearned luxury all the way to Paris, only to fly back to reality as despised, chained adversaries destined for a concrete cage. The transition from that freezing cargo plane to the sterile, imposing environment of the federal courthouse in New York was swift and brutal. The Southern District of New York does not waste time. Just hours after landing, the arraignment hearing was scheduled. I made sure I was there early. I wore a tailored charcoal gray suit, my hair pulled back neatly, projecting the professional detachment required in my field. I took a seat in the back row of the gallery, resting my hands on my lap. The courtroom was vast, paneled in dark wood, and smelled faintly of floor wax and old paper. It was a room designed to make you feel small. The heavy side doors opened, and the bailiff announced the arrival of the defendants. The clinking of heavy metal chains echoed through the quiet room before they even stepped into view. Brenda and Courtney shuffled in. They were a pathetic sight. Their orange jumpsuits hung loosely on their frames. Their hair was greasy and unkempt. They looked completely drained of the arrogant energy that had fueled their entire lives. They were directed to the defense table, accompanied by two exhausted-looking public defenders. Neither of them looked back toward the gallery. They kept their heads down, entirely consumed by their own misery. The federal judge, an older man with a reputation for zero tolerance regarding financial crimes, took his seat at the bench. He adjusted his glasses and looked down at the thick file before him. The atmosphere in the room shifted, growing incredibly heavy. The federal prosecutor stood up. She was a sharp, focused woman who did not mince words. Your Honor. The prosecutor began, her voice ringing out clearly. The government charges the defendants Brenda and Courtney with 1 count of conspiracy to commit international wire fraud, 1 count of aggravated identity theft, and 1 count of money laundering. These individuals bypassed a secure federal terminal, stole $860,000 of flagged government evidence, and immediately fled the jurisdiction to the Republic of France. The judge nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on my mother and sister. "And what is the government's position on bail?" he asked. "The prosecution vehemently opposes any form of bail." "Your Honor," the prosecutor stated firmly, "the defendants have already proven they are an extreme flight risk. The very nature of their crime involved fleeing the country to spend illicit funds. Furthermore, their domestic assets have been seized or frozen, meaning they have no ties tying them to this jurisdiction, nor do they have the means to post a bond. Releasing them would be a direct threat to the integrity of the ongoing federal investigation regarding the stolen cartel funds." The public defender representing Courtney stood up, trying to mount a feeble defense. "Your Honor, my client is a mother of 2 young children. She has deep roots in the community. She is entirely willing to surrender her passport and submit to electronic monitoring." The judge cut him off with a sharp wave of his hand. "Counsel, your client abandoned those 2 young children to flee to Paris with stolen government money," the judge said, his tone dripping with disdain. "The passport has already been surrendered because it was confiscated by Europol. I am looking at the federal asset forfeiture report right now. She has no home to return to. Her husband has secured a restraining order and filed for divorce. She has absolutely 0 roots left in this community. Bail is denied for both defendants. They will be remanded to federal custody pending trial." Courtney let out a loud, desperate sob, burying her face in her shackled hands. Brenda, however, was staring straight ahead, her face completely pale. She seemed to be having trouble breathing. For the record, the judge continued, looking toward the prosecutor. "What is the maximum statutory penalty for the charges combined?" "Your Honor," the prosecutor replied without missing a beat, "given the amount of money stolen, the international transfer, and the interference with an active federal investigation, the maximum penalty the government will seek is 20 years in a federal penitentiary for each defendant." 20 years. The words hung in the air like a physical blow. Brenda let out a short, high-pitched gasp. Her eyes rolled back into her head, and her knees completely buckled. She collapsed instantly, her dead weight pulling heavily on the chains connecting her to Courtney. The courtroom erupted into chaos. The public defenders jumped back. The bailiffs rushed forward to catch her before she hit the floor. Courtney was screaming, terrified by the sudden violent pull on her restraints. From my seat in the back row, I did not gasp. I did not stand up to help. I just sat there in my sharp suit, observing the cold, mechanical process of justice. They had thought they were above the rules. They had thought my money was their money. Now they belonged entirely to the United States government. Now they belonged entirely to the United States government. The reality of federal custody is a sensory deprivation tank of gray concrete fluorescent lights and the constant echoing clang of steel doors. For Courtney, the transition from sipping champagne at the Ritz to eating processed bologna in the Metropolitan Correctional Center took less than a week. She sat in a cramped, windowless attorney visitation room, picking nervously at the frayed hem of her orange jumpsuit. Across the scarred metal table sat her public defender, a tired-looking man named Richard, who had seen hundreds of arrogant white-collar criminals break exactly like this. Richard opened his battered leather briefcase and pulled out a single staple-bound document. He slid it across the table. Courtney did not look at it. She just stared at him with desperate, hollow eyes. "The prosecution has an airtight case," Richard stated, his voice devoid of any comforting inflection. "They have the high-definition security footage from your sister's house. They have the IP address logs, the biometric token access records, and the recorded phone call your mother made to your sister confessing to the break-in. If we take this to a jury, you will lose. The judge will hit you with the maximum penalty. You will be 56 years old by the time you see the outside world again. Courtney choked on a sob, burying her face in her hands. I cannot do 20 years, she wept. I need my life back. There has to be a loophole. My sister set a trap. That is entrapment, right? Richard sighed heavily. It is not entrapment when you break into a house and steal a security token, but there is a way to reduce your exposure. The prosecution is offering a singular plea agreement. They only need one of you to take the fall for the mastermind charges. If you agree to turn state's witness and testify against your mother, they will drop the conspiracy and identity theft charges against you. You will plead guilty to a single count of wire fraud. Courtney slowly lowered her hands. The tears stopped almost instantly. What does that mean for my sentence? She asked, her voice suddenly steady and calculating. The prosecutors will recommend 8 years, Richard explained. With good behavior, you could be out in 5 or 6. But you have to take the stand. You have to look at the jury and testify under oath that Brenda orchestrated the entire scheme, that she stole the house key, and that she coerced you into executing the transfer. You have to give them your mother. There was no agonizing pause. There was no moral conflict. Courtney reached across the table, picked up the cheap plastic pen Richard had set down, and signed her name on the dotted line. I will do it, she said coldly. She ruined my life anyway. 2 floors down, in the exact same facility, Brenda was sitting in an identical gray room. Her public defender, a sharp young woman named Sarah, did not slide any paperwork across the table. She just sat down and folded her hands. Brenda leaned forward, desperate for any shred of good news. When is my bail hearing appeal? She asked. I cannot sleep on that terrible mattress anymore. My back is in agony. We need to fight this. Sarah looked at Brenda with a mixture of pity and professional detachment. There is no bail appeal, Brenda, and we are not going to trial. The landscape of your case completely shifted an hour ago. Brenda furrowed her brow. What do you mean Natalie cannot possibly have more evidence? It is not Natalie, Sarah said softly. It is Courtney. Your daughter just signed a proffer agreement with the United States Attorney's Office. She has agreed to be their star witness against you. The words did not process immediately. Brenda stared at her lawyer, a blank expression washing over her face. Courtney. My Courtney, she stammered. That is impossible. We are in this together. I am her mother. I gave her everything. Sarah shook her head. She accepted a plea deal to reduce her own sentence. She is going to testify that you stole the key, planned the robbery, and forced her to participate. She has completely flipped on you, Brenda. Because she is cooperating, the prosecution is going to stack every single aggravated charge onto your docket. They are going to use your own daughter to guarantee you spend the next 2 decades behind bars. Brenda sat frozen in her plastic chair. The air seemed to vanish from the tiny concrete room. She had spent 36 years cultivating Courtney's selfishness. She had taught her that other people existed only to be used for her own comfort. She had sacrificed my college funds, Jamal's sanity, and our entire family dynamic just to ensure Courtney never had to face a single hardship. She had built a monster of pure entitlement. And now, trapped in a steel cage with no way out, the ultimate terrifying consequence of her parenting had arrived. When a golden child is backed into a corner and stripped of her luxury, she does not feel loyalty. She only feels hunger. And Courtney was perfectly willing to eat her own mother alive just to survive. While my mother and sister were busy tearing each other apart inside the sterile walls of the federal detention center, my own life was moving in the exact opposite direction. The following Monday morning, I walked into the sleek glass lobby of my forensic accounting firm. I swiped my badge at the turnstile, grabbed my usual black coffee from the break room, and settled into my desk. I fully expected a quiet week of analyzing routine financial statements. Instead, my desk phone rang before I even had the chance to unlock my computer. It was the executive assistant to the managing director, asking me to come to the top floor immediately. Usually, being summoned to the top floor of a federal contracting firm means you have made a catastrophic error. Given the fact that my own family had recently breached my home security to steal classified funds, I felt a brief moment of anxiety. I smoothed down my blazer, walked to the elevator, and rode it up to the executive suite. When I walked into the massive corner office, the managing director, a brilliant, intimidating man named Director Mitchell, was not alone. Special Agent Thomas Reynolds was sitting in one of the leather guest chairs sipping coffee and looking incredibly relaxed. Director Mitchell stood up behind his heavy oak desk and gestured for me to take a seat. I sat down, keeping my posture perfectly straight, preparing for a thorough interrogation regarding my compromised security token. Instead of a reprimand, Director Mitchell smiled. He clasped his hands together and looked at Thomas. "Tell her the good news, Thomas," he said. Thomas leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "We got them, Natalie," he announced, his voice practically vibrating with professional triumph. "We got the entire European branch of the Salazar cartel, and we got them because of your mother and sister." I stared at him in genuine disbelief. "How does stealing the honeypot fund lead to a cartel bust?" I asked. "They just wired the money to a random bank in Paris so they could go shopping." "That is exactly the point," Thomas explained. "The account they wired the money to was not random. When your sister bypassed your computer, she did not just send the money to any bank. She used the routing information that was already preloaded into the honeypot file. That account was flagged, but it was also directly linked to the cartel's European money launderers. When the $860,000 suddenly appeared in Paris, the French bank froze it immediately." Thomas took a sip of his coffee and continued. "But the cartel did not know it was your family who triggered the wire. They thought the federal government was actively seizing their offshore accounts. They panicked. They scrambled to move all of their other hidden assets before we could freeze those too. In their panic, they made mistakes. They transferred millions of dollars using unencrypted channels. Europol was waiting and watching. Over the weekend, French and Spanish authorities raided 12 different locations, arrested 30 high-ranking cartel members, and seized over $40 million in illicit funds. It is the biggest bust of the decade." Director Mitchell leaned forward, his expression turning serious, but deeply respectful. "The Department of Justice is absolutely thrilled, Natalie, and they are particularly impressed with you. When your family broke into your house, they unknowingly set off the exact chain reaction we needed. But more importantly, you proved that your personal security protocols are impenetrable by outside digital forces. They had to physically break into your home and steal a tangible token to access the network. Furthermore, your hidden cameras immediately exonerated you and provided airtight evidence for the prosecution. You protected the firm from a massive liability scandal." I sat there absorbing the absolute irony of the situation. Brenda and Courtney had broken into my house with the explicit intention of ruining my financial stability and using my resources to elevate themselves. They wanted to leave me with nothing. Instead, their greed had accidentally dismantled a massive international crime syndicate and handed me the ultimate professional victory. "Because of your exemplary handling of this crisis," Director Mitchell said, sliding a thick embossed folder across his desk toward me, "the board has unanimously voted to promote you. Effective immediately, you are the new senior director of the International Forensics Division. This comes with a substantial increase in salary, a corner office, and a dedicated team of junior analysts. You earned this, Natalie." I opened the folder and looked at the contract. The salary figure printed on the page was staggering. It was more money than Courtney had ever dreamed of making. It was more than enough to secure my future, to help Jamal send his boys to any college they wanted, and to live a life of absolute peace. I picked up the heavy gold pen sitting on the desk and signed my name. I walked out of that office not as a victim of a toxic family, but as a woman who had just conquered her entire industry. The weight of my childhood was finally gone, replaced by absolute, undeniable professional success. The weight of my childhood was finally gone, replaced by absolute, undeniable professional success. 2 weeks into my new role as senior director, I was sitting behind my massive mahogany desk, looking out through the floor-to-ceiling windows at the sweeping city skyline. The corner office was quiet, a perfect sanctuary of my own making. My personal cell phone buzzed against the polished wood. I glanced at the screen. The caller ID displayed an unknown number, but I recognized the local area code. I answered the call. An automated robotic voice immediately filled the line. You have a prepaid call from an inmate at the Metropolitan Correctional Center. To accept, press 1. I pressed the button and put the phone on speaker, resting my chin on my hands. Natalie, please do not hang up. A ragged, trembling voice pleaded. It was Brenda. She sounded completely broken, stripped of all the arrogance and polish she had worn like armor her entire life. I am here, Mom, I said calmly. She began to sob, the wet, heavy sounds echoing in my pristine office. Natalie, I am so sorry. I am so incredibly sorry for everything. I made a terrible mistake. I was foolish. I let Courtney pressure me into taking that key. I thought I was helping her, but I was wrong. And now she has completely abandoned me. She signed a plea deal. She is going to testify against me in federal court and tell them the whole thing was my idea. My own daughter is trying to destroy me to save herself. I have absolutely no one left. She paused, gasping for air, waiting for me to offer a word of comfort or sympathy. I offered nothing. I just listened to the silence stretch across the line. My public defender says the prosecution is going to ask for the maximum sentence. Brenda cried, her panic rising. They want to put me away for 20 years. Natalie, I will die in there. I am begging you. The judge is accepting character reference letters before the sentencing hearing next month. I need you to write one for me. Please tell the judge that I raised you well. Tell him I am a good mother who just lost her way. If you write it on your official firm letterhead, it might carry enough weight to reduce my time. Please, you are my only hope. I leaned back in my chair, looking at the city below. The request was so deeply selfish, so perfectly aligned with who she had always been. Even now, facing federal prison, she viewed me as nothing more than a tool to fix her problems. A good mother, I repeated, my voice dropping to a low, freezing register. Do you want to know when I realized you stopped loving me, Mom? Brenda stopped crying. She sniffled suddenly, very quiet. What she whispered. It was the 7th grade, I said, keeping my tone perfectly conversational as if I were reciting a grocery list. I had just won the state mathematics competition. It was the first time I ever won anything. They handed me a shiny gold medal and a check for $500. I was so proud. I ran off the stage looking for you in the audience, but you were not there. You were out in the hallway with Courtney because she was crying over not making the varsity cheerleading squad. I paused, letting the memory sharpen in the air between us. When I finally found you both, I held up my medal. Do you remember what you did? You took the check right out of my hand. You told me Courtney was going through a severe emotional crisis and needed retail therapy to heal. You took my prize money, drove her to the mall, and left me waiting on the steps of the school for 2 hours until a teacher finally gave me a ride home. When I asked you why you did it, you looked at me with absolute disgust. You said I was too independent for my own good and that Courtney needed a mother today. Natalie, that was years ago. Brenda pleaded weakly. I was just trying to balance things. You were not balancing anything, I corrected her sharply. You were making a choice. On that day, you decided I was not your daughter anymore. I was a resource. I was a bank account. I was a stepping stone for the golden child. And you held on to that belief, right up until the moment you broke into my home and stole federal evidence to fund her vacation. I took a deep breath, feeling completely detached from the sobbing woman on the other end of the line. So, no, Mom, I will not be writing a character reference letter to the judge asking for leniency. I will not use my professional credentials to shield you from the consequences of your own greed. I will, however, be submitting a formal victim impact statement detailing exactly how you violated my home and attempted to destroy my career. Natalie, please, you cannot do this to me, she screamed, the desperation turning into sheer terror. You are my daughter. Goodbye, Mom, I said with absolute freezing politeness. Good luck at sentencing. I reached out and tapped the red button ending the call. The office was quiet again. I picked up my pen and went back to work. 1 month later, the crisp autumn air had given way to a bitter, biting winter wind that whipped through the streets of downtown Manhattan. I stood outside the federal courthouse, wrapping my wool coat tighter around myself against the chill. Jamal stood next to me, looking sharp and composed in a tailored dark suit he had bought for his new life. Today was the final chapter. Today was sentencing day. We walked through the heavy metal detectors and rode the elevator in silence. When we entered the massive wood-paneled courtroom, the gallery was mostly empty save for a few court reporters and federal agents, including Thomas. My extended family, the ones who had sent those furious text messages demanding I drop the charges, were completely absent. When it came time to actually support Brenda and Courtney in their darkest hour, the enablers had scattered like roaches in the light. They wanted the drama, but they did not want the association with federal convicts. The side door opened, and the bailiff brought them in. The physical contrast between my mother and sister was stark. Brenda looked aged, her posture permanently stooped, her eyes vacant and defeated. She had clearly resigned herself to her fate. Courtney, however, still had a nervous, frantic energy about her. She had tried to style her unwashed hair and stood up a little straighter when her public defender whispered to her. She actually believed her plea deal and her rehearsed tears were going to save her from severe punishment. The Honorable Judge Davis took his seat at the high mahogany bench. He was a man who had presided over hundreds of complex white-collar criminal cases. He had seen every trick, heard every excuse, and possessed absolutely zero patience for performers. He opened the thick sentencing file, adjusted his reading glasses, and looked down at the defense table with an icy stare. "We will begin with the allocution of the defendant," the judge announced, his voice booming through the microphone. "You have the right to make a statement before I hand down your sentence." Courtney stood up. Her hands were shaking violently as she held a piece of lined yellow paper. She took a deep, shuddering breath, perfectly calculated to sound fragile and broken. "Your Honor," she began, her voice quivering, "I stand before you today as a broken woman. I know what I did was legally wrong, but I was not acting in my right mind. I was in the middle of a severe mental health crisis." She wiped a tear from her cheek even though her eyes were completely dry. "I was trapped in a suffocating, emotionally abusive marriage." She lied smoothly, not daring to look back at Jamal in the gallery. "My husband was completely unsupportive. He worked all the time, neglecting me and our children. I felt invisible. I felt like I was drowning in a mediocre life I never chose. I was pushed to the absolute breaking point. I did not steal that money out of greed. I took it because I desperately needed an escape. I needed to find myself so I could come back and be the mother my boys truly deserved." She opened her mouth to continue her rehearsed monologue, but a sharp, loud crack echoed through the room. Judge Davis had slammed his wooden gavel down onto the sound block, cutting her off instantly. "That is enough," the judge barked, his voice laced with pure, unfiltered disgust. "I have sat on this bench for 22 years, and I have rarely heard a statement so entirely devoid of personal accountability. You expect me to believe you stole nearly $1 million of flagged federal evidence because your husband worked too hard?" Courtney shrank back, her mouth hanging open. "But, Your Honor, I was so stressed," she stammered defensively. "Stressed," the judge repeated, leaning forward over the bench. "Do you know who is stressed? Your ex-husband, who works grueling shifts as a paramedic to save lives while you secretly forged his signature to mortgage the family home. Your children are stressed because their mother wiped out their college fund to buy designer handbags in Paris. You did not take a mental health break. You executed a highly calculated, malicious financial assault on your own family and the United States government. You bypassed secure federal networks." The judge continued, his voice rising in anger. "You triggered an international incident. You handled money belonging to a violent cartel, and yet you stand here today attempting to weaponize the language of trauma to excuse your own staggering vanity and greed. You sold out your own mother to get a reduced sentence, and now you are trying to assassinate the character of the hard-working man you left bankrupt. Courtney was trembling violently now. The public defender gently pulled her arm, signaling her to sit down and stop talking, but she was frozen in shock. No one had ever spoken to the golden child like this. No one had ever systematically stripped away her excuses and forced her to look at her own ugly reflection. You have shown absolutely zero remorse, the judge concluded, closing her file with a loud, definitive slap. You are only sorry that your credit card was declined at a luxury boutique. Please sit down. The court has heard enough from you. It is time we hear from the actual victims of your crimes. It is time we hear from the actual victims of your crimes. The bailiff signaled for me to approach the podium. I stood up, smoothing the front of my charcoal gray suit, and walked down the center aisle. I did not bring a crumpled piece of yellow paper. I did not need notes. I stepped up to the microphone, adjusted it to my height, and looked directly at the judge. Then I turned my gaze to the defense table. Brenda refused to look up. Courtney stared at me with wide, terrified eyes, silently begging for a mercy she had never once extended to anyone else. Your Honor. I began, my voice steady and completely devoid of the hysterics my sister had just displayed. I am a forensic accountant. My entire career is dedicated to tracking illicit funds, analyzing financial behavior, and holding criminals accountable. I look at numbers because numbers do not lie. They do not throw tantrums, and they do not make excuses. The numbers in this case tell a very clear, very cold story about the two women sitting before you. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with the clinical precision of an expert witness presenting a forensic audit. On the morning of October 12th, my mother and sister did not suffer a temporary lapse in judgment. They executed a premeditated breach of my home security. They navigated my classified terminal with the specific intent of enriching themselves at my expense. They saw an account holding $860,000 and believed they were inherently entitled to it. But the financial theft is only a fraction of their crime. I shifted my stance, looking directly at Courtney. The true victim of this crime is not the federal government, and it is not even me. The true victims are sitting in the gallery. Jamal worked grueling hours to provide a stable life for his family. In return, his wife secretly mortgaged his home, drained his checking account, and emptied the college funds of her own two children. She did this not out of desperation, but to fund a luxury vacation to Paris. She traded her family for designer handbags and first-class plane tickets. She traded her children's future for an illusion of superiority. I then turned my attention to Brenda. And my mother. I continued, my tone dropping to an absolute chill, facilitated this destruction. She taught her daughter that theft is acceptable as long as it funds an aesthetic. When confronted with the reality of a federal indictment, they did not feel remorse for the pain they caused. They only felt regret that their stolen credit card was declined. They are a danger to society not because they are violent, but because their greed is entirely boundless and completely devoid of a moral compass. I turned back to face Judge Davis. I ask the court to impose a sentence that reflects the severity of their betrayal. I ask that you protect the public and my family from their endless entitlement. Thank you, Your Honor. I walked back to my seat next to Jamal. The courtroom was silent. The judge looked down at the documents in front of him, folding his hands together. He looked at Courtney and then at Brenda. The prosecution has accepted a plea agreement regarding the defendant. Courtney, Judge Davis stated, his voice ringing with absolute finality. In exchange for her testimony, the state has agreed to drop the conspiracy and identity theft charges. However, given the massive financial damage inflicted upon her immediate family and the reckless interference with a federal investigation, I will not be lenient. Courtney, please stand. Courtney stood on shaking legs, heavily supported by her public defender. For the charge of international wire fraud, the judge declared, I sentence you to 8 years in a federal penitentiary, to be followed by 5 years of supervised release. You are ordered to pay full restitution to your ex-husband for the stolen domestic funds. Courtney let out a sharp gasp, collapsing back into her chair as the reality of 8 years in a concrete cell crashed down upon her. The judge then turned his piercing gaze to Brenda. "Brenda, please stand." Brenda slowly rose, her head bowed in ultimate defeat. "You orchestrated a burglary against your own daughter to fund an opulent lifestyle you could not afford," the judge said sternly. "You abused your position of trust as a mother. For your role in this criminal conspiracy, I sentence you to 4 years in a federal penitentiary." The sound of the heavy wooden gavel slamming against the block sealed their fates. The bailiffs immediately stepped forward, grabbing the chains binding my mother and sister. They were aggressively pulled toward the side door. Neither of them looked back. The golden child and her enabler were finally gone, swallowed entirely by the justice system they thought they could outsmart. The golden child and her enabler were finally gone, swallowed entirely by the justice system they thought they could outsmart. The wheels of the federal government turn slowly when building a case, but they move with lightning speed when it is time to collect a debt. Just 3 weeks after Judge Davis slammed his gavel, the United States Marshals Service organized a public liquidation auction at Brenda's property. The objective was simple: sell everything of value to satisfy the massive court-ordered restitution and pay back the funds stolen from the government and from Jamal. I did not have to go. My involvement with the criminal case was officially over. But I wanted to be there. I wanted to see the final dismantling of the stage where my mother had performed her lifelong play of superiority. I arrived at the gated community early on a Saturday morning. The iron gates, usually guarded by a strict security detail, were propped wide open to allow the general public inside. Cars lined the immaculate streets. Neighbors who had once attended Brenda's lavish holiday parties were now eagerly picking through her life, looking for cheap deals on her designer furniture and expensive china. The sheer humiliation of it was palpable. The women Brenda had desperately tried to impress were whispering amongst themselves, holding up her expensive silk curtains and laughing about her prison sentence. I walked up the stamped concrete driveway holding a cup of coffee and watched as auctioneers in bright polo shirts cataloged the contents of my childhood home. Every item Brenda had used to make others feel small was now sitting on the damp morning grass with a numbered white sticker attached to it. I wandered through the rows of luxury goods until I reached the back patio. There, standing tall and imposing against the brick exterior of the house, was the heirloom grandfather clock. It was a massive piece carved from dark cherry wood with a gleaming brass pendulum. For as long as I could remember, that clock had stood in the center of our formal dining room. Brenda used to polish it obsessively. I remembered a dinner party when I was 16. I had accidentally bumped into it while carrying plates to the kitchen. Brenda had scolded me in front of all her guests, telling me to stay away from it. She proudly announced that the clock was a symbol of our family legacy and that she was leaving it entirely to Courtney because Courtney was the only daughter with the refinement to appreciate true luxury. Now that symbol of refinement was sitting next to a pile of used patio furniture waiting to be auctioned off to a complete stranger. The lead auctioneer grabbed his microphone and stepped up to the clock. He briefly described the cherrywood finish and started the bidding at $1,000. The crowd was silent. Nobody wanted a massive heavy antique clock in their modern homes. He dropped the starting bid to $800. Still nothing. The neighbors were far more interested in the flat-screen televisions and the crystal glassware. He sighed, adjusting his microphone. "Can I get 500? He asked the crowd. I raised my numbered paddle into the cold morning air. 500, I said clearly. The auctioneer pointed a finger at me. 500 to the lady in the back. Do we have 6 going once? Going twice. Sold for $500. I walked over to the payment table, handed them my credit card, and received a receipt of ownership. I now legally owned the centerpiece of Brenda's manufactured legacy. I walked back over to the clock. It was ticking steadily, the heavy brass pendulum swinging back and forth, completely unaware that the family it belonged to had been shattered. I pulled my phone out and dialed a number I had saved the night before. Within 10 minutes, a large, battered box truck pulled into the driveway. The side of the truck read City Metro Junk Removal. Two men in heavy work gloves jumped out and walked over to me. I pointed to the grandfather clock. That is the item, I told them. The older worker looked at the beautiful cherry wood, admiring the craftsmanship, and then back at me. Are we taking this to a storage unit or a furniture restorer, ma'am? He asked respectfully. I shook my head, taking a slow sip of my coffee. No, I replied, my voice perfectly level. Take it directly to the municipal landfill. I paid for the premium disposal package. I want it crushed and buried with the rest of the garbage today. The workers exchanged a confused look, but they were being paid generously by the hour. They tipped the heavy clock backward, loaded it onto a hand truck, and wheeled it roughly down the driveway. They hoisted it into the back of the dirty box truck, laying it flat against rusted metal, broken appliances, and old drywall. The beautiful glass casing on the front cracked instantly under the weight of the rough handling, the brass pendulum clanking harshly against the wood. I watched the truck pull away, listening to the heavy diesel engine fade down the street. The clock was gone. The legacy was permanently destroyed. The house was completely empty. Everything Brenda had valued over her own flesh and blood had been liquidated, auctioned off to strangers, or literally thrown into the trash. I turned around, walked to my car, and drove away without looking in the rearview mirror. The clock was gone. The legacy was permanently destroyed. The house was completely empty. Everything Brenda had valued over her own flesh and blood had been liquidated, auctioned off to strangers, or literally thrown into the trash. I turned around, walked to my car, and drove away without looking in the rearview mirror. Exactly 1 year later, my rearview mirror reflected a completely different life. I parked my SUV in the spacious driveway of the new home I had purchased with my first senior director bonus. The neighborhood was quiet, lined with old oak trees, but the silence here was peaceful, not oppressive. I walked through my solid wood front door and was instantly greeted by the rich, savory smell of roasting turkey, garlic, mashed potatoes, and cinnamon spice. It was Thanksgiving Day, and for the first time in my entire life, I was actually looking forward to the holiday dinner. The sound of genuine, unfiltered laughter echoed down the hallway. I took off my coat and walked into my open-concept kitchen. Standing at the marble island was Jamal. He was wearing an apron covered in cartoon turkeys, expertly carving the massive bird, while his two young boys chased each other around the living room sofa. The heavy, exhausted slouch that used to define Jamal's posture was entirely gone. He stood tall, his eyes bright and full of life. "Look who finally made it out of the office," Jamal teased, pointing the carving knife at me with a wide grin. "I was starting to think the federal government was going to make you audit the pilgrims." I laughed, leaning against the counter and stealing a piece of crispy turkey skin from the cutting board. "The federal government can wait," I said. "Today is strictly off the clock." "How are the boys doing?" Jamal glanced over into the living room, a deep sense of pride softening his features. "They are doing incredible, Natalie. Their grades are up, they are sleeping through the night, and they finally stopped asking when their mother is coming home. They are just happy kids again, and honestly, so am I." He had every right to be happy. Over the past 12 months, Jamal had completely rebuilt his life. Without Courtney constantly draining his bank accounts and belittling his ambitions, he had finally taken the advanced certification exams he had been putting off for years. He was no longer working double shifts just to survive her spending habits. He was now the lead flight medic for a premier helicopter rescue team, earning a fantastic salary and doing work he was deeply passionate about. He had purchased a beautiful townhouse just 10 minutes away, creating a stable, loving environment for his sons. I remembered past Thanksgivings at Brenda's house. They were always a nightmare of stress and criticism. Courtney would complain about the food, while Brenda would interrogate me about my salary and demand I pay for their next vacation. Jamal would be banished to the end of the table, ignored entirely. That toxic dynamic was dead and gone. We carried the heavy platters of food into my formal dining room. The table was beautifully set, not with stiff crystal meant to intimidate guests, but with warm ceramic plates and a simple centerpiece of autumn leaves. There were no underlying tensions, no passive-aggressive comments, and no one demanding that I foot the bill. As we sat down, Jamal's oldest son reached out and grabbed my hand. Jamal took my other hand, bowing his head. The room grew quiet. "I want to say thank you," Jamal began, his voice thick with genuine emotion. "A year ago, I thought I was going to lose everything. But instead, I gained a real family. Natalie, you protected us when you did not have to. You gave us the space to breathe and rebuild. I am thankful for this food. I am thankful for this peace. And I am thankful for my sister." I squeezed his hand tightly, feeling a lump form in my throat. I looked at the three of them, the family that I had actively chosen. For 32 years, I had been tied to a biological family that viewed me as a resource to be mined. But sitting at this table, surrounded by the warm glow of the dining room lights, I finally understood what family actually meant. It is about the people who show up for you. It is about the people who celebrate your successes instead of trying to steal them. We spent the rest of the evening eating, watching football, and listening to the boys laugh. There was no drama. There was just the quiet, unshakable comfort of a life built on mutual respect. They were ghosts of a miserable past completely banished from the beautiful present I had built. They were ghosts of a miserable past completely banished from the beautiful present I had built. It was the Monday morning following that perfect Thanksgiving weekend. The house was quiet again, the kind of quiet that feels like a heavy, warm blanket. Jamal and the boys had gone back to their own home, leaving my sanctuary spotless. I poured my coffee, the dark espresso steam rising in the morning light, and walked out to the end of the driveway to check the mail. The winter air was sharp, biting at my cheeks, but I welcomed it. It made me feel awake. It made me feel alive. I opened the black metal mailbox and pulled out a small stack of envelopes. Most of it was standard. A utility bill, a glossy catalog for office furniture, and a few early holiday greeting cards from colleagues at the firm. But nestled in the middle of the stack was a harsh, stark white envelope made of cheap paper. It felt entirely out of place among the thick cardstock of the holiday greetings. I pulled it out and looked at the top left corner. Stamped in black ink was the seal of the Federal Bureau of Prisons. Below the seal was a return address for the Danbury Federal Correctional Institution. And written in a familiar, hurried scrawl was the name Courtney, followed by an 8-digit inmate identification number. I stood at the end of my driveway, the cold wind whipping my hair across my face, and stared at my sister's handwriting. A year ago, seeing her name on an envelope would have sent a spike of anxiety straight through my chest. I would have braced myself for a demand, an insult, or a fabricated crisis requiring my immediate financial intervention. Now I felt absolutely nothing. The envelope was incredibly thin. Maybe it contained an apology. Maybe it contained a desperate plea for me to put money on her commissary account so she could buy decent soap. Maybe she wanted me to tell Jamal she was sorry, hoping I could somehow bridge the massive gap she had created between herself and her children. I realized in that exact moment that I did not care what was written on the paper inside. Her thoughts, her regrets, her manipulations, they no longer had any currency in my world. The power she and my mother had held over me for 3 decades had been entirely liquidated. I turned around and walked back up the driveway, my boots crunching softly on the frost-covered pavement. I stepped back into the warmth of my house, locked the heavy front door behind me, and walked straight into my home office. It was the exact same room where this entire ordeal had begun. I walked over to the heavy-duty cross-cut paper shredder sitting next to my desk. I flipped the power switch. The machine roared to life with a low mechanical hum. I did not open the envelope. I did not even hold it up to the light to try and see the words through the cheap paper. I held it over the silver teeth of the machine and let it go. The shredder caught the edge of the envelope. With a loud, satisfying crunch, the blades pulled the paper down, slicing Courtney's name, her inmate number, and whatever desperate message she had written into hundreds of tiny, unreadable fragments. It took less than 3 seconds. When the machine ran clear, I pressed the power switch off. The silence that followed was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. People often ask me what it feels like to finally have money. They see the promotion, the house, the success, and they assume that wealth is defined by the balance in a bank account. But they are entirely wrong. Real wealth is not a dollar amount. Real wealth is the absolute unshakable freedom of cutting toxic people out of your life and never looking back. It is the ability to wake up in the morning and know that your energy belongs entirely to you and to the people who actually deserve it. It is the power to look at a locked door and know you hold the only key. Have you ever had to walk away from family members who only saw you as a resource? Have you ever had to destroy a relationship to save yourself? I want to hear your stories in the comments below. Do not be afraid to share your truth. If this story resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories about reclaiming your power. Share this video with someone who might need the courage to finally cut the cord. Thank you for listening to my journey. And remember, the family you choose will always be stronger than the family that chose to break you. The story of Natalie, Brenda, and Courtney serves as a chilling but necessary reminder of a hard truth: biological ties do not excuse toxic behavior. Society often pushes the narrative that family is everything, telling us we must unconditionally forgive the people who share our DNA. However, the ultimate lesson embedded in this dramatic downfall is that blood does not obligate you to endure financial or emotional abuse. Brenda and Courtney built their entire relationship with Natalie on a foundation of entitlement, viewing her not as a human being, but as a resource to be mined. They manipulated the concept of family loyalty to justify their own endless greed. Natalie's calm, calculated response teaches us the profound power of setting absolute boundaries. She did not yell, she did not seek revenge outside the law, and most importantly, she did not rescue them from the consequences of their own destructive actions. This narrative proves that true wealth is not found in a bank account or a luxury hotel suite. It is found in the peace that comes from protecting your own energy. Natalie's choice to let the justice system run its course and her decision to shred her sister's letter without reading it illustrates that sometimes the healthiest choice you can make is to walk away completely. We are allowed to outgrow the people who refuse to respect us. We are allowed to choose our own family just as Natalie and Jamal chose to build a peaceful life together without the chaos of their abusers. Letting go of toxic family members is a painful but deeply liberating process that paves the way for a life of genuine happiness. If you are currently dealing with a toxic relationship that drains your peace, take that first brave step today and establish a boundary that protects your future.